July 1943. The Russian steppes became the stage for the largest tank battle ever fought in history. Kursk. A name that evokes fire, steel, and death. Over 4 million men, 13,000 tanks, 12,000 aircraft, 2 titanic armies clashing in a battle that would decide the fate of the war on the Eastern Front. It was not just a battle of numbers, it was a battle of men. Men fighting inside scorching steel boxes under the July sun. Men who saw their comrades burn alive. Men who had to make decisions in fractions of a second, knowing that any mistake meant death. Today, we want to tell the story of Kursk through the voices of those who were there, not through maps or statistics, but through the direct words of 4 witnesses who experienced it firsthand. An ordinary soldier, a heroic captain, a marshal coordinating armies, and the collective memory of those who lived through that steel inferno. These are their authentic, verified, and raw testimonies, the voices of those who lived Kursk and could never forget it. Before hearing the testimonies, we must understand what made Kursk so special and so terrible. After the defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans needed a decisive victory on the Eastern Front. Hitler ordered Operation Citadel, a massive offensive to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. Thanks to espionage and aerial reconnaissance, they had the German plans weeks in advance. They built incredible defenses, 8 defensive lines, thousands of bunkers, massive minefields, and concentrated enormous reserves of tanks. When the German attack began on July 5, 1943, hell was unleashed. The battle lasted more than a month. The climax came on July 12th at Prokhorovka, where over 1,000 tanks clashed in a single day. It was the largest tank engagement in history. The Germans deployed their new tanks, Tigers and Panthers, steel beasts with 88mm guns capable of destroying a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. The Soviets responded with numbers. For every German Tiger, there were 10 T-34s. Soviet tank crews developed desperate but effective tactics: get as close as possible to strike weak points. What followed was not a battle. It was a mechanized slaughter. Tanks exploded, crews burned alive. Fields were littered with smoking wrecks, and amidst all this, men continued to fight. First testimony. Lev Nikolaevich Malinovsky. Lev Nikolaevich Malinovsky was 23 in July 1943. He was a soldier in the Red Army, a member of a T-34 crew. He was not a decorated hero, not an officer, just an ordinary young man caught in the largest tank battle in history. During a pause in the fighting, Lev wrote a letter to his brother, describing in simple, direct words what it meant to fight at Kursk. The letter survived the war, was kept in family archives, and was later donated to a Russian military museum. His words show the battle from inside a tank, the perspective of someone loading shells, aiming, firing, someone feeling unbearable heat, someone seeing comrades die in nearby tanks. Today's fighting lasted 5 hours. Along with our artillery, we burned and destroyed 21 German tanks. Dinner was brought to the line, but I was too exhausted to eat. My tunic was soaked with sweat. 5 hours. It seems brief, but 5 hours inside a T-34 in combat is an eternity. The T-34 was a reliable tank, but it had a major flaw. It became an oven. External temperatures in July reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tank, with the engine running and the gun firing, it easily rose to 122 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews fought in undershirts, some stripped completely. Sweat poured off them, making handles and controls slippery. Tankers drank liters of water, but it was never enough. Dehydration was as constant an enemy as the Germans themselves. Lev wrote of destroying 21 German tanks, a staggering number. But context matters. It did not mean his tank alone destroyed 21 Tigers. It meant that his unit, together with supporting artillery, put 21 enemy vehicles out of action that day. Fighting at Kursk was chaotic. Dust and smoke clouds reduced visibility to near zero. Tanks moved in formations that quickly broke apart. You fired at anything that moved. Soviet artillery, positioned behind the lines, constantly pounded German positions. When an enemy tank was hit, it was often impossible to know whether your shot or an artillery shell had destroyed it. What strikes most in Lev's letter is the final sentence. "Dinner was brought to the line, but I was too exhausted to eat." After 5 hours of combat, a normal man would be ravenous. But the physical and mental exhaustion was such that even eating was impossible. Muscles no longer responded. Hands shook. The mind was numbed by deafening cannon fire, explosions, and the adrenaline that kept you alive for hours. Lev survived Kursk. He continued fighting until the end of the war. He returned home in 1945. In post-war interviews, he recalled partially losing hearing in his left ear due to explosions, and described how for years afterward he could not bear the summer heat. It reminded him too much of the T-34 oven. Lev's testimony shows Kursk from the ground up, from the perspective of the ordinary soldier fighting to survive and simply make it through the day. There are no grand strategies in his words, only fatigue, heat, and the simple fact of being alive. Second testimony, Captain Skripkin, the hero who charged the Tigers. Not all Kursk testimonies come from letters or diaries. Some come from official reports. Cold, technical military documents that, at times, tell stories of extraordinary courage. Captain Skripkin commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 181st Tank Brigade, part of the Soviet 18th Tank Corps. His full name is not fully documented in declassified archives, a common detail for many mid-level Soviet officers. Yet his story is preserved in an official Red Army report. The report, kept in the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense and declassified in the 1990s, describes an episode during the most intense fighting at Kursk. The words are bureaucratic, but the story is of sheer desperate heroism. Captain Skripkin's T-34, commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 181st Brigade of the 18th Tank Corps, charged into a formation of Tigers and destroyed 2 before an 88mm shell struck the turret and another penetrated the side armor. The Soviet tank caught fire, and the wounded Skripkin was pulled from the vehicle by Sergeant Nikolaev and radio operator Zyryanov. They took cover in a crater, but one of the Tigers spotted them and advanced. Nikolaev and loader Chernov jumped into the burning tank, started it, and drove it directly into the Tiger. Both tanks exploded on impact. This terse, military-style testimony encapsulates an incredible drama. Skripkin charged a formation of Tigers, the most feared tanks on the Eastern Front. Heavy, slow, nearly invulnerable from the front, with 88mm guns capable of piercing a T-34 from impossible distances. One Tiger could destroy 10 T-34s before being put out of action. The Soviet tactic against Tigers was desperate but effective. Get as close as possible. At close range, the side and rear armor of a Tiger was vulnerable, but closing the distance meant crossing direct fire from an 88mm gun, watching comrades explode one after another while continuing to charge. Skripkin destroyed 2 Tigers, a remarkable feat, but then his tank was hit twice, once in the turret, once on the side. The T-34 caught fire immediately. Soviet tanks had a fatal flaw. They burned easily. Diesel, theoretically less flammable than German gasoline, ignited quickly when struck by hot, armor-piercing rounds. Once a T-34 was on fire, the crew had mere seconds to escape before being roasted alive. Sergeant Nikolaev and radio operator Zyryanov pulled the wounded Skripkin from the burning tank and took cover in a crater, likely created by a previous explosion. They thought they were safe, but a Tiger spotted them. German Tiger commanders were trained to eliminate surviving enemy crews, not out of cruelty, but for tactical reasons. A surviving tanker today could return with a new tank tomorrow. It was better to eliminate them while vulnerable. The Tiger advanced on the crater. Skripkin, Nikolaev, and Zyryanov were trapped, unarmed, with nowhere to flee, about to be crushed. Then something extraordinary happened. Nikolaev and Loder Chernov made a reckless decision. They ran to the burning T-34, climbed inside. The heat must have been unbearable. Flames enveloped them, yet they started the engine. The burning T-34, with 2 men already ablaze inside, moved toward the Tiger, not to fire, but to ram it. Nikolaev drove it directly into the German tank. The impact was devastating. The T-34 exploded. The Tiger struck on the side also blew up. Nikolaev and Chernov died instantly, but they saved Skripkin and Zyryanov. The report does not say what happened afterward, whether Skripkin survived his wounds or if Nikolaev and Chernov received posthumous medals. It is only one military report among thousands, but it tells the story of Kursk better than 1,000 statistics. It tells of desperate courage, absolute loyalty among comrades, and the sacrifice of those who knew they would die, but acted anyway to save others. At Kursk, stories like this were the norm, not the exception. Third testimony, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the marshal who commanded armies. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was already a legend by 1943. He had defended Moscow. He had encircled Stalingrad. He was the greatest Soviet military commander. Stalin called him "my general who never loses battles." At Kursk, Zhukov held a unique role. He did not command troops directly on the battlefield. He was the supreme coordinator of Soviet forces. He had to synchronize 3 fronts, the Central Front, the Voronezh Front, and the Steppe Front, manage millions of men, and decide when to launch counter-offensives. In his memoirs, published after the war, Zhukov described the crucial moments before and during Kursk. His words show the battle from above, the perspective of someone moving armies like pieces on a chessboard, but also of someone carrying the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. At 2:20 a.m., after repeated discussions in mid-May 1943, Stalin firmly decided to confront the German offensive with fire from all types of deeply echeloned defenses, with powerful air attacks and counterattacks from operational and strategic reserves to completely destroy the enemy, after wearing them down with a powerful counteroffensive in the Belgorod-Kharkov and Orel directions. This seemingly technical sentence encapsulates a monumental strategic decision. The Soviets knew the Germans would attack. The question was, what to do? Some generals wanted to strike first, to seize the initiative and surprise the Germans. Zhukov and Stalin decided otherwise. They would wait. They would let the Germans crash against deep defenses. Then, when the Germans were exhausted, they would counterattack. It was a risky strategy. It meant sacrificing ground. It meant accepting enormous losses during the defensive phase. But Zhukov believed it was the only way to win decisively. Zhukov also described the monstrous scale of the battle. The battle involved over 4 million men, about 70,000 guns and mortars, more than 13,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and around 12,000 combat aircraft. 4 million men. Let's try to visualize that number. It is larger than the entire population of many modern nations, all concentrated in a relatively small area, all engaged in deadly combat. 13,000 tanks. Lined up, they would stretch for dozens of kilometers. 12,000 aircraft. The sky was literally black with planes during the fighting. But Zhukov also understood what was at stake. It was not just a tactical battle, it was the decisive moment of the war on the Eastern Front. Both commands were fully aware that the outcome of the battle would have a decisive influence on the results of the summer-autumn 1943 campaign, and also on the outcome of the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War. Zhukov knew that if Kursk fell, the entire Soviet front would collapse. Germany would gain time. Perhaps it could negotiate peace. But if the Soviets won, the road to Berlin would be open. In his memoirs, Zhukov rarely speaks of emotions. He is always technical, always strategic. Yet at times, the weight of command is evident. When he describes losses, when he speaks of the necessary sacrifices, one can sense the burden of a man who sent millions to the front, knowing that hundreds of thousands would not return. At Kursk, the Soviets lost around 860,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. The Germans lost about 200,000 men. But Zhukov was right. The Soviet Union could replace those losses. Germany could not. Zhukov survived the war. He became Minister of Defense. He fell from grace under Khrushchev. He died in 1974, honored but often forgotten by the regime he had saved. His memoirs remain one of the most important sources on the Eastern Front. The testimonies of Lev, Skripkin, and Zhukov show Kursk from 3 different angles. But there is a fourth voice we must hear, not of a single person, but of thousands. The collective voice of those who lived Kursk and recounted it in the following years. Historians who interviewed hundreds of Soviet and German veterans have painted a terrifying picture of the battle. They speak of fields covered with smoking wreckage, of tanks exploding like fireworks, of crews burning alive while screaming inside their steel boxes. They speak of the noise, so deafening that many veterans permanently lost their hearing. The roar of engines, the thunder of guns, the explosions, the screams, all merging into a hellish symphony that never ceased. They speak of the smell, burning diesel, gunpowder, charred flesh, a stench clinging to clothing, skin, and lungs, lingering in the memories of veterans for years after the war. They speak of fear, the fear of seeing the flash of an enemy gun and knowing you could be blown up in a second, the fear of feeling your tank hit and not knowing if you would escape before it caught fire, the constant, gnawing fear that consumed more than the fighting itself. But they also speak of camaraderie, the absolute brotherhood among crew members. Inside a tank, you were a family. You shared everything: food, water, fear, death. Crews developed bonds beyond ordinary friendship. They were willing to die for each other, as Nikolaev and Chernov did. Kursk lasted from July 5th to August 23rd, 1943, 49 days of continuous fighting. When it ended, the Germans were defeated, not annihilated, but stopped definitively. They would never again launch a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had won, but at what cost? 800,000 casualties, thousands of tanks destroyed, entire villages leveled, fields left littered with wreckage for years. Why retell Kursk 80 years later? Why listen to these voices? Because Kursk represents something fundamental about modern warfare. It was not a battle of elegant maneuvers or brilliant strategies. It was a brutal clash of men and machines, industrial warfare in its purest and most terrifying form. The testimonies we have heard teach us different lessons. Lev teaches us that behind every statistic is a human being. When we read, The 62nd Army destroyed 400 German tanks. We forget that inside those tanks were men fighting, sweating, dying of exhaustion. War is not numbers, it is people. Kursk was a decisive Soviet victory. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But that victory was built with blood, steel, and sacrifice. 20-year-olds burning alive inside tanks, sergeants charging enemy tanks knowing it was a one-way ticket to hell, generals sending entire armies to slaughter. The voices of Kursk speak across decades. They tell us, this is what we lived through. This is what we endured. Do not forget. And do everything to never experience what we went through. Leave a comment telling us which World War II battle you would like us to cover in the next video. See you in the next video.